What does it mean to move the entire energy industry forward? How can utilities across this industry best prepare for some of the biggest challenges in existence? And why is it so important for individuals across this landscape to not just be thinking about such things, but also taking an active part in these changes? So these are just some of the questions that Meghan Lyons Calabro is dealing with every day. As the Vice President of Distribution and Modernization at Burns& McDonnell, she's at the forefront of some of the biggest shifts that are happening in today's electric grid. So we wanted to find out how she's thinking about this transformation and navigating it, as well as the work that she's doing as part of the DTEC Planning Committee, which is such an important part of this overall journey. So Meghan, thanks so much for taking the time to connect.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremiah. I appreciate it.
So, I want to talk about the present of the industry and what you're working on today. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of jump to the past because you've worked as an electrical engineer and department manager in numerous capacities. So, what can you tell us about how that experience has defined the way that you think about things and approach your job today?
Ironically, I've worked in a couple different industries during my career, and I feel like even that has helped to shape my perspective on grid modernization. When I first started out of college, I was an electrical engineer doing building design for like hospitals, clinics, in the healthcare space. And what I found myself really getting excited and passionate about was essentially that reliability, that e- extra resiliency that's needed for that sector. But then also the fact that there was a lot going on in the building automation and control side of things. And so in terms of energy efficiency and lead kind of the green sustainable buildings wave, if you will, that was happening in the space. And so really, I feel like a lot of the things that I ended up doing there in that industry when I moved over to T&D really ended up shifting, and it was the same concept, just on a much larger scale. So I think that that was pretty helpful in terms of getting a little bit of diversity from the industries that I've served. And then in terms of the serving as a department manager, I've served as a project manager, I've served as a kind of business line manager, and I think that all of those different roles have also given me good perspective on how all these different perspectives need to come together in order to solve the overall problem. And frankly, you know, my time as a department manager really realizing that at the end of the day, we need to get everybody excited and motivated and moving in the same direction. And that's the same thing, again, whether I'm talking about an internal department or whether I'm talking about an industry that's going through massive change.
I imagine too, it's given you a perspective on the practical implications of some of the things that we're talking about because I mean, it's easy to get caught up in how things are going to change for quote unquote the grid in 5 or 10 years, but like, what does that mean to those managers that are dealing with the ramifications of that stuff like today and tomorrow? And I think sometimes that can get lost when we get too big picture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, kind of taking a step back and looking at that macro and then zooming in and thinking about how it's impacting a bunch of smaller, communities or subcultures within either a community that a utility serves or within a company, and the different departments that make up that company.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the macro, so let's go all the way there. You've called out how your work with electric utilities to efficiently prepare for the grid is some of the biggest challenges in existence. So, what can you say about some of those changes? Are they more about I mean, obviously the demand is pushing it, but what's the frame that you view that around? Is it about the demand itself, or about the technology that's enabling that, or in some cases not enabling it?
I mean, I think in general, when we think about the buzzwords that a utility cares about historically, it always comes down to safety, reliability, and affordability. Those are over time, the three most important words to an electric utility. So adding on two significant factors would be technology and then also regulation. And I think that the technology part in the grand scheme of the next 50 years of the grid is actually going to be the simpler piece of the equation. I think the regulation is what will be the most challenging because in addition to having, federal regulation, there's also the state regulation and what might really resonate in one part of the country might not resonate in another. And, even if it resonates today, in 4 years when new appointments are made to that, whether it's appointed or elected from a commission or a PUC perspective, it could completely shift the temperature of that group, which then ends up completely turning the direction that the utilities in that, you know, domain need to follow in order to be successful.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And like that's a challenge too, isn't it? Because if you just focus on the technology in terms of what it can do, what it's capable of doing, how it's going to change, just from a technology perspective, like that's great, but that has to be filtered through that regulatory, that practical reality. And I think that's where it can sometimes get lost.
Yeah, and I think that that's also where the general public doesn't necessarily appreciate the complexity. I think that oftentimes electric utilities can be kind of the bad guy. Oh my, and without anybody having awareness of the markets and all the things that are dictated to the utility, that the utility then needs to operate around. So that has been super interesting for me. And as someone that is, married to another engineer in a different industry, I think that the conversations we have around the dinner table about some of the challenges in the industry, it's eye-opening to me because this is somebody that, appreciates a complex problem, but the regulation just makes it 10 times more complicated.
And do you see that as one of the bigger challenges, or maybe even on the to-do list for utilities, is better communicate what those challenges are, but then even too how they're rolling out some of these AMI programs, things that are creating efficiencies, but it's kind of happening in the background, or it's that piece of technology that isn't all the way there, so maybe they don't want to talk about it until it is, but of course in a vacuum, then it's just my bills are going up, and yeah.
Yeah, and I do think that um, the narrative and the way that the utility tells the story, particularly when it comes to rate cases, that that changes over time, and what the regulators care about, and that changes over time too, because they're responding to what all the customers in their particular region care about. So we do need to get better at taking a complex problem and figuring out how to explain it in ways that make sense to different audiences. Some that are very financially savvy, but maybe not technically savvy. Some that are, that are concerned about more of the sustainability impacts or the energy transition. And I think that as a whole, the entire industry is really learning a lot about how to take those complex topics and like break them down into more manageable and more relevant to the audience
Yeah,
discussions.
no, makes sense. You talked about some of the biggest topics in the space that are, whether it's safety or whether reliability and some of those new ones. How do you help clients balance what it means to kind of focus on all of those things at once versus the one that they're most struggling with? Like, what does it mean to have a balance in a way that you can client can move forward with?
For every single scenario, every single utility at every point in time, it looks slightly different. And so, I think one of the best things that we can do in terms of helping utilities to navigate that is to have a general awareness of everything that's happening trend wise across, maybe it's North America, but then really to go hone in on the specifics that are cared about in that service territory, to understand what the current temperature is at the PUC, to understand the local politics, to understand, how the federal regulatory changes are being received and impacted. Um, I would tell you that a couple years ago, the needs on the distribution grid, for example, were such that it felt like the asset renewal and the grid modernization was hugely important, and it felt like that kind of trumped the affordability for a while. Getting some of those changes out, getting the distribution grid prepped for the future. At this point, I think because of a lot of things that are happening, above the distribution grid, so things that are happening on the transmission network and the market and the, capacity needs that we have right now. Um, it feels like when it comes to the distribution grid, affordability has become much more meaty of a topic, and become much more important to the commissioners. And so again, that like even just the step change from maybe 3 years ago to today, it's an entirely different scenario in terms of how we would advise utility clients to prioritize and weigh those different, you know, factors, if you will.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about what do you see as the most significant challenge in the space today? But I mean, I think we just kind of talked about it in terms of getting your arms around what's the on the ground reality, and that's going to
Yeah,
vary depending on the utility.
I think that across the board right now, certainly in the U.S., I feel like the transmission interconnects and then just the capacity, the need for additional capacity, that sets the stage for everything else that's happening in the T&D space. Is that, hey, we need, we want to be able to build these data centers. We need to site them. We need to get them through permitting. We also need the generation to be able to serve those loads, and then we need the transmission, to do all the connections. And so frankly, right now, I think that that is the biggest pain point across the United States, um, everywhere is, hey, we feel like we're in this almost arms race, if you will, in terms of who can get AI data centers built. And in some instances, it's even been considered, a national defense topic, because if we aren't getting the AI, um, if we aren't getting the data centers out there soon enough, then other countries will. And so again, from a like national security perspective, I've heard that becoming much more frequently tied. Um, and again, I feel like that's the biggest, loudest battle. But at the end of the day, all these other parts of the T&D space are going to have to align in order to make those a reality.
And with that kind of alignment, do you see the role of traditional utilities evolving? I mean, we talked about the technology, but as things like microgrids and decentralized energy systems become more prevalent, is that role going to similarly evolve or change?
I think it absolutely could. I think that, if we looked back 10 years ago, and there was a lot of discussion about like whether the utilities would become a thing of the past, and this concept of like the death spiral, the utility death spiral, remember?
Right.
Um, at this point, I think everyone is aware that again, the transmission needs and the sheer capacity needs that we have are such that the utility is going to be critical in that model. So I feel like the narrative has changed a little bit, and it's, now, hey, how are we considering the locations where, we have parts of the country where they are not responsible for any of their own generation, but that also means that they have no control over pricing. And again, the complexities and the challenges have changed, but I do think that the role in the utility will absolutely be critical moving forward, but it definitely is going to look different than today.
We touched on a lot of stuff here, but you obviously play a role, an essential role in the DTEC planning committee, and to seeing how a lot of these content and conversation is part of the event that is taking shape in February next year. It's going to be in San Diego. Can you talk a little bit about how you, with your fellow committee members, how you guys talk about these topics both throughout the year and then when you come together for as a committee, but then also what it looks like to take what are, I mean, countless different ideas, the number of different abstracts, and turn that into a real program that is relevant to this space.
Yeah, I actually like being part of the Distributech committee for me it's one of my favorite things that I do each year for a couple reasons. One, I think that when we get all the abstracts and start to read those and process those, for me, it's very telling of what the industry thinks is important right now. And it's something where, over the years, the Distributech, DTech folks have been tracking, which abstract topics are most popular, which which are received the best in terms of the feedback after the event, et cetera. And that's constantly changing, right? And that's part of the kind of the cool part of DTech as a conference is that it really is a conference that's shaped around what is important to people in this industry today, not 2 years ago, not 5 years in the future. And so we're constantly trying to, rehash and recategorize based on what we think that the most important and relevant topics are that particular year. So yeah, I love reading through the abstracts because I do get a good feel for what the hot topics are. It's also really obvious at times where people realize that there is a particular topic that might be like, one of the buzzwords of that year, but we don't necessarily have a lot of good lived examples of it. We don't have good case studies yet. And so that's always one of the balances that we try to find too when we're doing selections for these abstracts is, hey, there's some topics that people really want to talk about. They really want to know more about, but they also don't want it to be super surface level. They want it to be some deep dives. Clearly, over the years, it's become blatantly obvious that people want to hear the case studies where, they are far enough in where they can start to talk about the things that didn't go well and the things that did go well, because utilities want to learn from each other. They don't want to reinvent the wheel 40 different times if, their colleagues or peers in another utility have already gone through the challenges. So I think those are some of the big things. But like I said, it's one of my favorite times of year is reading all the abstracts and then getting together with a group.
But that focus on practical uses and case studies, I mean, that lines up with everything that we hear from the audience, that it's not about in theory or on paper what this could look like, but what does that actually look like for the folks in the field as one of the big differentiators for the event, which is great to hear. We talked about the regulatory piece. Was that one of the ones that floated up top in terms of what was top of mind for you in the committee as you were reading through, just what was on, I mean, literally everybody else's mind?
I will say that, yes, that is something that, and actually, I think the last several years, that's been something that we all agree is a hugely important topic. We actually don't get a ton of abstracts in that category or along that line of thinking. And, perhaps part of it is that a lot of utilities, they want to make sure that they stay in good graces with their relevant public utilities commissions. And maybe there is also an awareness that, hey, even though this is relevant in my particular neck of the woods, I realize that there would be a totally different scenario for this set of regulators in this part of the country. So I think that there are some good submittals about just the challenges from a regulation perspective, but not a whole lot of utilities that are wanting to come and share like success stories or share their lessons learned from learning how to better work with their respective commissions. One of the things that's important for folks to know is that each year, DTech really does put a lot of thought and energy and time into how to create the best experience for everybody that attends the conference. And so, some of the specific examples that I can think of, last year, I serve on both the Grid Mod Committee and on the formerly Utility University Committee. And last year, opening up that set of sessions that are more deep dives, typically they're 4 or 8 hour classes. The turnout last year, so the 2025 turnout for Grid University was tremendous and, unlocked an entirely different type of learning and content for folks that attended DTech. So I'm excited about that because that's going to expand again in the coming year in 2026. And I'm just excited that more folks will be able to take advantage of that. Not necessarily only the utility attendees, but also the vendors and the consultants, et cetera. One of the blatantly obvious things that we know is happening in the industry is just we've got a lot of turnover in terms of the experienced part of the workforce that's hitting that retirement age. And so the number of folks that need to get that almost baseline understanding of a specific topic, for example, maybe it's SCADA or maybe it's a DNP3 class. Um, that's really valuable in terms of if you're a company that has a lot of new employees coming in the door and trying to get some good quality education to your folks, this is a great way to do it.
And you talked a little bit about the benefits or the benefits of being part of the committee and that it exposes you to the things that the industry is thinking about. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of that in terms of just the way that you're able to do your job or to connect with other utilities? I mean, I imagine it just gives you a perspective and the ability to have conversations that you just wouldn't otherwise.
Absolutely. I think that, one from the other committee members, not necessarily even the ones that are on my same, subcommittee, but all of them in general. I know that these are all people that are passionate about the industry that want to help to advance it and get through the challenges of the day. Um, and so those are people that have become, great resources for me to reach out to, you know, hey, how did utility X, like, how did you guys approach this? And when you were trying to decide between this type of solution, a centralized versus a decentralized, walk me through the thought process and are you happy with how that went? Just the ability to have some great contacts in other, in all parts of the country and from different sectors, both on the technology and on the, devices and from the consultant side, really, I feel like allows me to just broaden the network of great, talented individuals that I interface with, and then I can take that into my job every day.
So we talked about what you're looking forward to with DTech specifically, but I mean, if we pull back to the industry as a whole or 2026, like, is there anything coming together on the technology side or on the policy side that you're looking forward to or looking out for in the short term?
Moving forward about 5 years. So again, I think the next 5 years are all going to be about the bottlenecks are going to be on the transmission, the interconnect queues, and on new capacity um, to serve these data center loads. Um, I think moving beyond that, I think we're gonna have an entire snowplow of things that got kind of buried under the main, priorities that we'll then have to clean up. And so again, I think that just mindfulness from the industry on, hey, we can switch and we can pivot our focus to really hone in on problem number one. But what that means is in 5 years, we're going to have a lot of stuff backed up that we weren't paying attention to that, even just from like an asset life cycle, would require a decent amount of work to catch up.
No, makes a lot of sense, and I'll use that or connect that into my last question for you, which is advice for utilities that are going through that in terms of what does it mean for them to best sort out how they can prioritize that, how they can come up with that list. You just mentioned that, first things first. Like it's so easy to get caught up in like there's so much to do, everything is happening at once. We gotta focus on and do all of it. Like what does it look like to pull back from that and to make that kind of list?
Oh, that is the question for the ages for this industry. Um, I do think that we've hit a point, and part of it has to do with, current climate and the economics in the US, but I do think that affordability for the next ten years is going to be key, especially when we consider just the spending power that some of these data center clients bring to the market. It looks totally different. And so, again, really trying to hone in on kind of like the various users, if you will, um, that play into the space and trying to keep affordability top of mind. They're not going to be able to do all things at once, but one of the things that I'm most excited about in terms of where I think the industry needs to head from a technology is perspective is that oftentimes based on the way that utilities receive funding, um, projects are done in kind of these buckets, right? They'll get like a bucket of funding for a particular thing, and then they'll do that across a large swath of their service territory. Or maybe it'll be that they're getting a bucket of funding to focus on their, customers experiencing multiple interruptions. So the worst performing feeders. When we have different projects and programs that are happening in parallel, one of the crappiest side effects of that is that a utility might go and do something substantial on a feeder only to come back to that same feeder 2 months later via a different bucket of funding to do something else. And instead of, managing both of those tasks on that one feeder at one time, they're going back and like essentially doing a lot of rework. Um, and so I think one of the biggest things that we'll be able to do here is to really focus on some sort of systems and platforms and programs where we can track all the different various initiatives that are happening at a utility at one time so that we can try to streamline those and make them a little bit more efficient. And then, frankly, like looking down the future, probably 25 years, I think one of the biggest things that I'm excited for in the industry is just this concept of like, hey, even if we are able to automate some of the engineering and some of the processes, we still have to build the infrastructure. And so it almost feels like the pain point then becomes to the labor on the construction side, or the folks that are actually doing the operations and maintenance, the linemen, et cetera. And so one of the things I'm pretty anxious to look into the crystal ball for is, hey, what parts of that sector, on the construction side, like the scale is just so massive and we will not have the resource pool. Are there parts of construction that we can streamline, where we can leverage new technologies to make the building of a new distribution line easier, or to, do some sort of a swap out on a particular type of asset on a lot of poles in a distribution line, for example?
No, I appreciate those specifics. And to me, so much of that comes back to that concept of community, but it's community in terms of how utilities are communicating to their local utilities, but then also the utility community itself. How are different utilities in different regions sorting through all of that and being able to have those lessons learned and insights? Like it just gives everybody a much better position to move forward, because then it's based on something, even if it needs to go in a different direction, it's based on something they know versus an unknown.
Yeah, yeah, they're taking the collective knowledge and experiences across the industry and leveraging that to move themselves forward in a smarter way, as opposed to, again, uh, reinventing the wheel or going through the same challenges that utility two states to the west, has already stumbled through. So,
Agreed. Well, Megan, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk everything through. Looking forward to staying in touch and seeing you at DTech.
yes, can't wait for DTech 2026.